I think next up we should probably chat, and chat is possibly generous because I'm also going to leave this up to Alex because he is the expert here, really. But to chat or talk about some of the rendering features available on Blackwell and indeed across a lot of NVIDIA GPUs for many of these features. So first up, we have the neural shader, which as far as I understand it, is a way to use tensor cores for graphics tasks using neural networks that's outside of the typical NVIDIA suite of DLSS and associated technologies. Is that about right, Alex?
That's about it. Basically, if you can go back in time, and they actually interestingly did this in the presentation, which is how I would have done it. They go through the introduction of programmable shaders to things like the geometry shader, the tessellation, and Hall stage, and then eventually compute, and then to ray tracing. And those are different shader types that the GPU has in various stages. But now they're introducing a new one, the neural shader, essentially. And this is covered by a new API that will be coming out from Microsoft. I think it's going to be like a subsection of DirectX 12. I have no idea what they're going to end up calling it. I don't know if we're just going to be eternally in DX 12 or whatever, and just with this like little dashes and points afterward. Back in the day, they used to kind of do that, like DirectX 9.0A, 9.0B, 9.0C. They used to do that kind of thing. But that's more dev-centric stuff. But the whole point is it being covered by DirectX is going to make it much more easily accessible to developers. Also, the DirectX blog post mentions that Qualcomm, Intel, and AMD are on board. They're going to presumably present their own way to do this in the future. And for the gamer, though, you can kind of go back to the video we put out covering our CES demo and all these other things just on was it Monday? Yes, of this week, where we go through this NVIDIA booth and they showed off two very compelling technologies using these things. Neural materials, which is basically bridging the gap to offline film rendered materials, making games right now use very simplified models for performance reasons and also potentially memory reasons. But here, using these neural materials, running a real time on the GPU, incredible performance speed up versus the offline stuff while looking really good. And the other thing that I think is going to be very relevant for RTX in the longer term future as well is this neural texture compression, where they're saying it should have like a 7-to-1 better level ratio of compression versus standard block compression formats, like, I don't know, BC5 or something. And this is interesting because it's a neat trade-off where we can only throw so much hardware into a GPU over an amount of time. And I think NVIDIA is constantly talking about this. And this is one way to leverage some of the few specialized hardware we do have, things like machine learning and tensor cores, and to increase the perceptual quality for the amount of disk space and space in VRAM. Now, the thing to point out, this neural texture compression is not like Kraken on the PS5 or anything like that. It's not taking a compressed format on disk and then uncompressing it into memory. What it is doing, it is taking that compressed format, bringing it over to GPU memory, and the machine learning is extrapolating upon it in real time in a deterministic fashion to make the texture look good. That is the compression. It is not going. The reason why it's important is because it uses less VRAM, where things like Kraken do not use less VRAM. They're about disk saving and as well as streaming speed. So this is a different type of technology. It's not like a decompression tech, for example. That's something different. So just so everyone knows that it's phenomenologically different. But yeah, that's kind of the usage for the neural shader there. Currently, we won't see much of this, and I think in the immediate short term, but this is something for years after the fact, as well as when the next Xbox comes out.
So there's another kind of key feature here, which is shader execution reordering, which I think NVIDIA introduced with the Ada Lovelace architecture. Has a lot of applications in terms of improving shader execution in ray tracing workloads, in particular in very divergent ray tracing workloads. So could you explain what the kinds of improvements we're going to see in Blackwell are to that SER key feature?
Yeah, basically the problem with doing diverse and complex workloads on the GPU is that you start losing the inherent benefit of what a GPU is, a massive parallel processing unit. Shaders work in that way. That's why we have so many shaders, and we only have, up to like 16 cores on like a standard high-end CPU. They're a lot smaller and less capable in some aspects than a normal CPU core, but in parallel, they're really great, and you can keep stacking them up and you'll still see scaling. Things like path tracing, harder ray tracing workloads, divergent workloads of any type. This will also happen in compute shaders of any variety too. Will just decrease the amount of throughput that you're getting. You're just not going to be as efficient. So things like SER are kind of batching the workloads up into ways where they can be handled more efficiently instead of wasting the amount of lanes available at any one moment and waiting for the next cycle. And this was introduced and demoed and used in games through shader execution reordering. Essentially, it's a different API call versus standard DirectX ray tracing. So you'd be using NVIDIA-specific stuff there. And I think there's also a Vulkan version of it. So in Vulkan, it'd be an extension. And here they talked about being 2x efficient versus the previous implementation. So this is one thing the slides don't show off at all, but potentially without multi-frame gen on, we could be seeing path tracing games running a bit better on Blackwell versus Ada in a way that doesn't line up necessarily with the spec differentials and performance we see in rasterization games. Another thing they talked about it with this here is they also mentioned that it's just like they used machine learning workloads as another aspect of SER where it's going to be improving efficiency. And I think this is not talking about the current DLSS dynamic, but rather SER working for potential future neural rendering things. So like games that would use things like neural texture compression, and neural materials, or any other thing that developers cook up.
Okay, great. Now moving on to some of the more exciting and kind of sexy features, I think, in Blackwell and other NVIDIA GPUs here. We've got RTX Mega Geometry, which is designed to handle scenes with incredible geometric complexity. And it really is quite something to observe in motion. So could you kind of go through this? Obviously, we've already discussed this at some length in DF Direct, but could you kind of give us a little primer on what has been disclosed here with RTX Mega Geometry?
Yeah, as I described there, RTX Mega Geometry is solving the problem that for really complex and moving geometry or changing geometry due to the level of detail changing, the current ray tracing APIs leave much to be desired there. That's why Unreal Engine 5 has nanite, so you can get up close to an object and see all the nice polygons there, but the ray tracing version of that scene is actually much lower quality. And as a result, the lighting will suffer. You cannot do things like direct shadows without switching over to VSMs, which have their own kind of trade-off in quality, performance, and memory. Basically, we want to have a way to make geometry that is movable, deformable, and LODable run better in ray tracing. And RTX Mega Geometry is their proposal for, like I described earlier in the architectural part of this video, a way to do this in hardware and in software, because there's an API associated with it. There's an MV API. And as I heard behind the scenes, there's also going to be Vulkan extensions. How and when this gets into DirectX is another question, but I'm presuming like everything NVIDIA does, there's a lot of talking quite a long time beforehand with Microsoft to get it up and running. Because don't forget, they demoed off DXR the first time on NVIDIA GPUs, and that API was most definitely made with NVIDIA GPUs in mind. So we'll see how this evolves in the future. But in the mid to short term, we're going to probably see this in some capacity in Unreal Engine 5 games. I imagine any of the stuff that is NV sponsored is going to be shipping with it, as well as it applies to any other modern game that uses things like mesh shading. So I'd imagine Massive Entertainment, who made things like Outlaws and Avatar, would be adopting this in the future. We also saw an incredible usage of mesh shading in Alan Wake. They are going to be adopting it, and I believe there might be a patch for that game coming as soon as January 30th, which would enable RTX Mega Geometry in that game. And it does, like I said earlier, apply to older RTX GPUs. We just don't know about the amount of speed up it will give there.
Right.
But this is only a good thing. It's the way the RTX APIs needed to evolve for the demands of future games, and we're actually seeing it now, and it's first from NVIDIA.
Yeah. No, it's certainly a kind of mind-blowing demo, I gotta say, especially when they go over to the polygonal view and you see all those all that incredible noise there, and just how detailed those models can be. It's really quite something. But there is another technology here that might have some applications, some really compelling visual applications that you can see in games in a pretty short period of time, which is RTX Hair, which, as far as I understand it, is basically a solution to the problem of ray tracing in Hair. It's so complex, it's so challenging to light that using ray tracing. Here, there's basically a technique that's been worked out with optimizations that seem specific to Blackwell GPUs here that allow for Hair to be ray traced in a more efficient and effective manner and actually make it possible and plausible to do so in real-time rendering.
Yeah, exactly. So going back to the architecture, another part of the new RT Core is the accelerated tracing against or intersection with, they call them linear swept spheres all throughout the presentation. But then we went to the booth and everyone was calling them something else, Landstrospheres. And I was like, I wasn't sure if my brain was tricking me. I think if we go over the recording, we hear that all the way in the booth. So maybe there is a marketing name and maybe there's an internal development name, kind of like you saw with PSSR, right? And yeah, so basically this is just a new primitive, as they call them, like the triangles of primitive, that can be traced against. And this is currently used in the demos here, as well as it's going to be coming to Indiana Jones. For things like Hair, it'll be giving apparently heavily increased performance versus doing it with triangles, as well as giving the same level of, visuals there, if not better. The question is how it will be used in the future. I don't know. It was hinted at that could be used for things that aren't just Hair and surprising ways. It was also not at all talked about what exactly happens on older GPUs. Would this be a feature that runs really fast on Blackwell, but then runs a lot slower on older GPUs? Or does it not run at all on older GPUs? I don't know. Another thing to mention is that this is going to be in Vulkan most likely, and it'll be an NV API, but DirectX, is still on version 1.1, which I think came out in like 2020-ish, 2021 maybe, when AMD brought out their RDNA 2 on PC. And so this will not be just like a standard DirectX thing for whenever, basically when Microsoft is not resting, but active, and, at least in a forward-facing manner. So yeah, this is interesting, but for now, we're going to see it mainly in NVIDIA-sponsored titles.
Yeah, I got to say, looking at these Indiana Jones screenshots that NVIDIA has provided, there is a very clear improvement in lighting fidelity in the RTX Hair on view, with Hair that has more of that kind of sheen and shine. It doesn't have like the artificiality to the shadowed regions. I think it looks quite nice there. It doesn't look overly smooth as video game Hair so often does nowadays. There are a few other features here that I think we want to work through as well. One of them is the neural Radiance cache,
right?
Which, as far as I understand it, is basically a way to accelerate and improve, hopefully, the quality of indirect lighting and ray traced scenes by caching, storing, retrieving that data, maybe giving you an opportunity to do more bounces through the scene, this kind of thing. Alex, could you kind of describe the NRC there?
NRC is something we talked about on DF Direct in the past, and I think I mentioned it once in some other video. Maybe it was one of my Tech Focus videos, but the basic conceit is that path tracing is very expensive. Doing multiple bounces past one or two is very expensive, and so games in the past, as well as with normal ray trace GI, will cache that into some sort of structure in the world, in screen space, like Lumen does, or, there's a lot of ways to cache these results and run them, in parallel, slowly over time, updating temporally. And this, this can lead to lag, and it can also lead to other bunch of negative phenomena. But it is a good way to get more than one or two bounces in a game world for certain things. NRC, based upon the research papers, neural radiance caching, works by actually doing the training on the GPU in real time. It is not just inferencing, it's training and inference at the same time, which is new. And it would be running on the scene right in front of you, and the lighting results that are being path traced in that moment. And then it's storing them. And then it is essentially allowing you to get more bounces over time. And you can actually tweak it so that you could get increased performance, because instead of sending out more rays over time to fill this cache, which would be usually in world space or screen space, you're now just kind of assuming them based upon the training. So it actually can increase performance. And they showed this in the demo, which was using Half-Life 2 RTX. It looked better. There was more nuanced, smaller, detailed lighting. Like they specifically called it out on the cobblestone streets here in Ravenholm, but it also ran a little bit better. I mean, we were already talking about pretty high frame rates here with MFG on, but it ran a little bit better. And once again, this is something that currently I imagine will only be really applicable to heavily RTX sponsored titles. We have yet to see it in any title released, but I presume it's coming to Half-Life 2 RTX as well as Portal RTX or whatever in the future. But other titles, I can't really say.
Okay, so there's also an interesting technology that, as far as I know, is not in the public domain as of yet, but was revealed in this little presser here, which is RTX Skin, which seems like a new method of doing subsurface scattering, albeit not in screen space, I would presume. Can you kind of go through this, Alex?
Yeah, basically, when we're ray tracing in real time in hardware, it is against triangles, and triangles are only representing like a small section of a 2D plane. And when they're arranged, we get the sense of 3D, right? But real life particles of light will, enter a surface, they'll bounce off it, whatever, to give you reflection. But when they enter a surface, they will scatter around underneath it and maybe come back out the other at a different angle. And that gives us, like when you hold your hand up to light, you can see like along the edges that light will, go through your hand, and, depending upon your skin pigments, it'll have a different look for different people. But, it'll give that look of light coming through the side of something. It'll make it look semi-translucent. And in games, that is usually super heavily faked by using things like shadow maps and like screen space techniques, which can do it. A lot of games actually do it almost entirely in screen space, excluding things like ears, where they'll have like a little map there that'll make it work from even when the light is occluded off screen. But in ray tracing, we need a way to do that is actually efficient, and this is a hardware-based way to do it in real time that doesn't use machine learning, if I recall. So it is a new way, a technique to do subsurface scattering using hardware ray tracing. They only showed it off here mainly in, once again, Half-Life 2 RTX, where they're making these, it's going to be a showcase for whatever NVIDIA stuff can do. But whether or not this is coming to other titles in the future, it's really hard to say. This is something NVIDIA made.
So, Alex, I feel like we'd be remiss if we didn't retread some ground here on DLSS 4, because I think that's probably the most immediate, impactful thing that NVIDIA has to show us today, especially for users of older GeForce cards, but in particular with this new Blackwell series and MFG. So could you kind of go over the various improvements, the new transformer model for super resolution, the new machine learning based models for frame generation and indeed multi-frame generation, and obviously the improvements to ray reconstruction, which would probably fall under that super resolution banner as well?
Right. So let's just run through super resolution and ray reconstruction first. The core difference here is they are upgrading the model from using convolutional neural network to a transformer model, and that is used for much more complex things usually, but here they're using it for visual images, real-time temporal amortization of frames to give anti-aliasing and a higher resolution in the end. And they were basically saying we're seeing a lack of improvement over time by using the previous model, so we're going to use this new one, and specifically for Blackwell, leverage the new, much more powerful in certain ways tensor cores. So it's going to be more expensive to run potentially, but increased quality. Now, I imagine with Blackwell, it'll be little to no performance hit versus the previous model, because the tensor cores are so fast and there's so many of them that they're actually finishing execution before it's, like actually becomes a problem of frame time. But with the older GPUs, such as RTX 2000 and 3000, maybe 4000, depending upon what's happening, it could actually be a performance hit that is noticeable. We don't know yet until we have the cards on our hands, but there's a lot of demos out there. They have one specifically of Horizon Forbidden West where you can just see a lot more temporally stable detail on like the back of Aloy there, on like one of the packs on her back or whatever. And super resolution already looked really good, so it looking better is interesting. It's just like another win, I guess, in that case. But I think one thing to mention is that it's coming out experimental first. They're going to allow you to change it in the NV app on a per game basis, I believe, whether you want to use the transformer or the CNN model in older games. But I think it's coming out experimental because they don't consider it like 100% ready yet in some ways. So there could be regressions for all that I know. But that's it for super resolution. Now for ray reconstruction, we had more issues with it. It was really good, but we had more issues with it in terms of quality. And based upon Rich's preview and our just hands-on looking at it there in the demos that we talked about before, it looks a lot better. And this is like a full-on replacement in that regard. It's getting rid of a lot of the smearing, over-sharpening, stylization issues that the original model had that we looked at in Cyberpunk as well as in Alan Wake. So this just looks like another straight win, but presumably a little bit more expensive on older RTX GPUs due to the fact that it is a new transformer model, which is apparently heavier. So yeah, ray reconstruction, super resolution. Then the big talking point, the controversial thing is frame generation, as always. And multi-frame gen here is the new thing with Blackwell RTX 5000. Basically, previously before you would have two real rendered frames, as you would maybe call them, and then by holding onto one of the frames and using optical flow. I always forget the name of this. You're good at this, Oliver. Optical flow processor in the previous GPUs, RTX 4000, as well as machine learning network and things like the motion vectors from the game. It would synthesize an in-between interpolated image, essentially. And that would potentially, in the best CPU limited scenario, give you 2x the frame rate. But because of the cost of this thing in real time, it would actually typically be in a GPU limited scenario, not 2x of whatever you could have previously had before without it. We thought the quality was good enough to be recommendable above 40 FPS usually, but also it was very game dependent. You could see more artifacts in different types of games. That's the way it was before with RTX 4000. Now, instead of just synthesizing one in-between frame, it can synthesize up to 3 in-between frames, like a 4x boost in total of the potential CPU-limited frame rate, maybe. And that is interesting. It is controversial because that is the way NVIDIA is focusing their entire, I would say, performance profile and their advertising. They say things like RTX 5070 equals RTX 4090 because multi-frame gen exists, when, as we know, an RTX 4090 does not have 12 gigs of VRAM. The shading power is going to be completely different without MFG on. A lot of stuff is going to be different. So that's how NVIDIA is focusing it. But I would say subjectively, in my first impressions, it was very convincing. It didn't look bad or anything like that. It looked good. And another thing to just really harp on for the audience is that, you really shouldn't be turning this on within like the 30 FPS realm to start getting, above 100 FPS and things like that. This is really meant for the same kind of application cases as you would have previously. So above 40 FPS minimum, but preferably 60 and above. So this is the way to start filling out new types of monitors that are coming out, like 240 hertz or 165 or, even above that, 360, 480. So that's kind of like the real usage angle there for me. And that's how I would kind of describe it. But NVIDIA doesn't describe it that way. They describe it like as a whole on performance improvement, which is very different. In terms of just like subjectively, another thing to mention is that you are generating more frames, but they're still persisting on screen for the same amount of time the previous amount of frame gen would have, just divisibly. So you have to think about it like this, like in where there would have been one synthesized frame before in between being interpolated. Now you could have up to 3. So a lot of people are thinking like that this is like some sort of linear process where, oh, every frame is equal. The thing is, this is not true. The higher you get up in frame rate, the less time they are persisting on screen. So the chance to notice issues in them is actually lower. And that is one thing that we have struggled with in our coverage of frame gen of all types, whether it be lossless scaling or FSR3, is to convey that, yes, a generated frame can have many issues in it, and they're easy to point out, but they are only on screen for X amount of time while rapidly strobing in between more perfect frames. So frame gen is really hard, and we can't show it off on YouTube, and it's really something you have to experience yourself to start super critiquing. But that's really about it. We'll talk more about this at the end when we get to like the kind of conclusion here. But DLSS 4, a lot of the SR and RR is like the big deal that I think for me, but a lot of the press and a lot of the NVIDIA themselves are responsible for this. A lot of people are talking about multi-frame gen, and that is one of the bigger upgrades of Blackwell versus Ada Lovelace.